The question about the validity of the process that made then Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio the Pope has been called into question by many different people with many different competing or even complementary theories about the whole thing. And I don't generally take a side in that debate. I do definitely have questions about Pope Francis's validity, and frankly, I'll be surprised if a future pope doesn't declare one way or the other and against him in some way because of the errors and heresies that have come out of it. But and maybe even using one of those theories or more of them, or maybe even a new theory that hasn't either gotten a lot of traction or that no one has thought up yet. But in the debates about it, I don't generally take a side. I have questions and I'd like to have them answered, but unfortunately, that's not going to happen either this side of eternity or at least this side of a incredible restructuring or restoration of orthodoxy in the papacy. And I generally wait for the hierarchy to do something, which is why something I have for you tomorrow is compelling. I want to put this on your radar now. Tomorrow, Saturday, August 24th, I have a letter written by laity challenging the highest profile cardinals in the church by name to do something about Pope Francis and his heresies. The cardinals they name are the highest profile ones associated with resisting him to his face and have all been canceled to one degree or another by Pope Francis for defending the faith. We need more people to challenge Pope Francis and his efforts to turn the Catholic Church into the synodal church, which they admit they're doing, by the way. That's what they're doing. They're trying to transform the Catholic Church into the synodal church. That is exactly the language they use, transformation, which is why I think you should tune in and check that out tomorrow. But our topic today is that, well, we have Archbishop Viganò naming the names of the bishops responsible for fixing the outcome of the conclave of 2013 that turned Jorge Bergoglio into Pope Francis, and he connects them to the passing of Cardinal Pell. And he connects the passing of Cardinal Pell to the passing of another cardinal that everybody's forgotten about, who was not coincidentally the predecessor of Vigano in the United States, who had been trying to let everybody know about Ted McCarrick, and who had himself also been looking into the financial misdeeds going on in the Vatican. Do you see the picture that's coming together here? We also have Vigano admitting that he still lives in hiding and doesn't stay in any one place for very long, that he still very much lives in fear for his life because of the things that he knows. And now he's starting to let those things out. Keep in mind that Vigano is now in his early 80s, which means he knows he doesn't have that much time left, probably, which is why he is now starting to name names. And quite frankly, I think the real reason he was excommunicating for saying things many bishops say publicly, they said he was excommunicated for challenging Vatican II. Well, he's not the only bishop who's done that. He says it in a more strident way, but in substance, he says the same things many other bishops say. It's because of what he knows. That was why he was excommunicated. By declaring him to be excommunicated, many will uncritically accept that he can't be trusted on anything and that he is now an enemy of the church, despite that many of those same people don't trust a single thing that comes out of Rome. Why they accepted that excommunication when they don't trust anything else that Rome does, I don't know. It's a mystery to me. But this, what Vigano says here in this interview he gave to an Italian news outlet, really will help put pieces together for people. So the story comes from Il Messaggero, which is an Italian news site, and Life site kind of does summary, but we're going to go right to the source here. So this is the translation is using an extension so we can actually just interact with it directly. Their headline is Monsignor Viganò, the Archbishop excommunicated by the Pope. I fear for my life. Bergoglio wanted to get rid of those who knew too much. Last month, he was put on trial in the Vatican for publicly declaring that he did not recognize either the authority of Francis or the Second Vatican Council, both crimes of unprecedented gravity. Okay. Calling it unprecedented gravity is a bit much. Again, he's not the first to be unjustly and likely illegally punished for questioning Vatican II, and he's not going to be the last. And if you are familiar with the processes at Vatican II, you'll understand why people question them. That Pope John the 23rd and Cardinal Ottaviani had a whole series of Catholic documents ready, expected the council to take 6 weeks. They had all of everything ready for the council, and on day one, they silenced Ottaviani and tossed out most of those documents and changed heavily the ones they kept. That was what happened. And by they, I mean the Paridi, who were the experts who had been finding themselves jobs in the Roman Curia and helping to control the flow of information and other things. Okay, so that's why a lot of people question Vatican II, because the council's processes were unprecedented in history, among other things. But in this interview, Vigano states that he is in fear for his life. He puts a couple of things together. We know about Cardinal Pell, who went in for routine surgery in Italy and passed away as a result of it, which was mysterious and noteworthy that people from across the church's ideological spectrum noted that that was kind of odd for him to have happen to him. Pell wasn't the first high-profile cardinal in Italy to pass away due to a routine surgery. Vigano's predecessor in the U.S. had this happen too, who was an Italian who went to Italy for surgery. And it's all really, really weird. Vigano in the interview is asked about where he resides today, and he's asked about Ted McCarrick and everything around that. He's asked about these topics in a series of questions. I'm going to synthesize his answers here for you. This is pretty eye-opening. Quote, after the release of my memoir on the McCarrick case in August 2018, a contact of mine from the United States warned me that my life was in danger. This is why I do not reside in a fixed place, meaning he moves around constantly. I do not want to end up like Cardinal Pell, nor like my predecessor in Washington, the nuncio, Cardinal Pietro Sambi. He also strenuously faced then Cardinal McCarrick. Sambi passed in circumstances that have never been clarified after a banal operation, meaning run-of-the-mill, ordinary operation. The certificate issued to the nunciature did not explain the causes of Sambi's passing, on whom an autopsy was never performed. That's a little weird. When I was in the Secretariat of State as delegate for pontifical representations, I personally dealt with the McCarrick case, and since then I have asked for his removal from the cardinalate. My direct superiors are responsible for not having taken into due consideration my judgment based on incontrovertible testimonies. Obviously, McCarrick's actions were convenient for someone in the Secretariat of State. I'm thinking of the huge sums raised through the Papal Foundation that McCarrick had established in the United States. It was precisely to Monsignor Sandri, then substitute, that I delivered my note on McCarrick, but ambition and the prospects of career advancement induced him to remain silent and hide the scandals. Bergoglio owes his elevation to McCarrick, and also for the secret Sino-Vatican agreement, strongly desired by the Jesuits and the establishment party who had their big party in Chicago last night. The role of the former Cardinal of Washington is well known. The former Cardinal of Washington is Ted McCarrick. The punishment against him, decided only in 2019, served to save the reputation of the pontificate. Unfortunately, there was no fair canonical trial, and the witnesses were not given opportunity to name the accomplices, and the judge was unable to impose any compensation for those harmed by McCarrick, since Bergoglio arrogated to himself the right to define the causa judicata without divulging the official decree, which is also a public act. The administrative measure decided had to hide the network of complicity despite the crimes having been known for decades. End quote. In other words, the normal procedures were thrown out, the results were kept hidden, other than McCarrick having been removed from the cardinalate and laicized and handed over to the secular authorities. They did it to save face, but they didn't let any of the details out because it wasn't just McCarrick, it was a network of people, as you'll find out here. And there's a couple of key figures here to talk about. No one is surprised that Ted McCarrick would work behind the scenes to pull strings for Bergoglio at the conclave. That's one of the things he's saying here. McCarrick is a longtime associate of the late Cardinal Martini, who was the head of the old St. Gallen group. I say old because they're still around, but they've got a whole bunch of new members. And he was supposed to be Pope instead of Bergoglio, but he got sick before the 2005 conclave that very nearly gave us Pope Francis instead of Benedict XVI. And Martini was more well-known. He might have actually won the conclave and become Pope in 2005 if he hadn't gotten sick. McCarrick was perhaps the most influential cardinal in the world after Cardinal Martini due to his financial and political connections, including political connections to certain American agencies. McCarrick was, to put it mildly, a very bad person with some very bad connections to very bad people in the American imperial system. That should not surprise anyone, nor is it a surprise that he would work behind the scenes to fix the outcome of the conclave for Bergoglio, and it explains why Francis protected McCarrick until public pressure got too hot for him in 2018. And I say fix because Cardinal Daniels publicly said that they engaged in activities that would have invalidated that conclave according to the laws set forth by John Paul II in some of his motu proprios in the 1990s. They admitted to it. Does that invalidate the selection of Bergoglio? Some say yes, some say no. He is universally accepted as Pope, so many err on the side of that for that reason. Future Pope will decide. But the other character here Vigano names is Cardinal Sambi, who was Vigano's predecessor as a Vatican diplomat to the United States. That's what a papal nuncio is. He passed away in 2011 due to weird complications in surgery, like Cardinal Pell for a few years later. In 2018, Crux.com ran this story that has long since been forgotten. And I'm a little surprised when I found this when I was preparing for this, because Crux is not an outlet that I would expect it to even ever go here. So their headline is Sambi, a veteran papal diplomat, allegedly told Rome about McCarrick. Now, this is in 2018. This is the aftermath of Vigano's letter. I remember this period because Vigano's letter was published in print media right after the feast on the new calendar of Mary, Queen of Heaven. And I noticed it wasn't on YouTube at all. So my channel at that time had like 300 subscribers. So I recorded it, uploaded it, walked away, went back to applying for jobs or whatever it was I was doing, came back the next day and saw that my channel had like doubled or tripled in size. Okay, because no one had put an audio up of it. And so I remember that period very well. We were talking about that letter for 3 months on YouTube and elsewhere. And so this is right around that time of when that debate was happening. And that's worth noting for context here. See, Vigano in his 2018 letter that changed the course of everything in the church named Sambi as his source for information about Ted McCarrick. That's kind of a significant detail, given what we know that happened to Cardinal Sambi. From the Crux article, quote, Sambi emerges in Vigano's letter as someone who took immediate action on information involving McCarrick's misdeeds, following the proper procedures. In his letter, Vigano said that both Sambi and his predecessor, Colombian Archbishop Gabriel Montalvo, quote, did not fail to inform the Holy See immediately as soon as they learned about Archbishop McCarrick's gravely immoral behavior with seminarians and priests. It was Sambi, Vigano said, who provided him with information about a letter sent to the embassy by Father Boniface Ramsey in 2000, detailing rumors about McCarrick's misconduct with seminarians. It was the first recorded complaint against McCarrick sent to ranking Vatican officials. 2000. That's the date. According to Vigano, at one point, Sambi also sent Italian Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone. Fatima people who pay attention to Fatima, that name should be a giant red flag for you. Then the Vatican Secretariat of State and, quote, indictment memorandum against McCarrick by Gregory Littleton, a former priest laicized for doing McCarrick-type things, along with 2 documents in which Littleton recounted his own bad things that happened to him by McCarrick and that of several other priests and seminarians. In his letter, Vigano asserts that in Sambi's correspondence with Bertone, Sambi noted how Littleton in 2006 had forwarded the memorandum to roughly 20 people, including civil and ecclesial judicial authorities, police, and lawyers, and it would therefore likely be made public. Sambi, Vigano said, called for a prompt intervention by the Holy See. Vigano said that he also sent Sambi's report with all the attachments to Bertone, and that Bertone did nothing. When Benedict XVI allegedly imposed private sanctions on McCarrick, stipulating that he was to move out of the seminary where he'd been living, that he was forbidden to say Mass in public or participate in public meetings, and he was also barred from traveling or giving speeches and asked to dedicate himself to a life of prayer and penance, it was Sambi who communicated the news to McCarrick, Vigano said. Vigano also claims that Sambi informed McCarrick's successor in Washington, Cardinal Donald Wuerl, of the accusations against McCarrick and the private sanctions put into place by Benedict XVI. End quote. Cardinal Bertone was one of the ones who was behind the release of the alleged Third Secret of Fatima in the 2000s. The one that, when you look at it, is at the very least missing half the message, the explanation for the vision. And some have suggested that the vision they brought forth wasn't the actual vision from the Third Secret of Fatima either. And he has been exposed as being not credible in the slightest on Fatima by Italian journalists who looked into who thought traditionalists on the Fatima question were completely off our rockers. And then he went and looked at our claims, investigated them quietly, and found that we weren't off our rockers. Bertone is a key figure in that story to bring Fatima into this. But shortly after everything I just told you about here, Cardinal Sambi passed away from a surgery that should have been fine. That was routine. Kind of like Cardinal Pell. Kind of an odd coincidence, isn't it? In that long poll quote, we just heard another name too. Cardinal Bertone, who was the Cardinal Secretary of State before Cardinal Pietro Parolin took the job a few years ago. The post that post is the Vatican's chief diplomat, which means that Bertone would have likely been interacting with Cardinal McCarrick frequently. Remember, McCarrick was the architect of the China deal, which Pietro Parolin has said repeatedly that the Vatican will be re-upping. Vigano clashed with Parolin's predecessor, Cardinal Bertone, who also helped to ensure the outcome of the 2013 conclave that gave us Pope Francis, according to Vigano. So we now go back to the Il Messaggero thing, because, again, we went to Crux because it has some important context for all of this, because context is important. And where he's asked about this clash with Bertone, because he battled Cardinal Bertone frequently. And here's Vigano's response. It's pretty short. He said, Bertone, did everything he could to remove me from the Secretariat of State. Remember, the Secretary of State's the chief diplomat. Papal nuncios are Vatican diplomats. That's where they're housed. He says, in my very delicate role at the nunciatures, I prevented him from promoting his candidates, often corrupt. He thus managed to transfer me to the governorate in 2009, where I discovered the role and complicity in covering up corruption. Benedict XVI convinced me to accept the nomination to the United States of being papal nuncio. So he was a nuncio, and then they kicked him out of there because Bertone didn't like him, and then Benedict put him back in there. Before Vigano was a papal nuncio of the U.S., he had been investigating financial wrongdoing in the Vatican. Benedict XVI sent him to the U.S. for his own protection, according to Vigano. He has said that multiple times in interviews. Eventually, Cardinal Pell would pick up the task of continuing to investigate financial wrongdoing in the Vatican Bank. What did they both find? Vigano and Pell have publicly said that they had found millions, if not billions with a B collectively, of dollars hidden away, misappropriated, or outright hidden and off the records, and used for all sorts of wicked things. And for this, Vigano was punished by being kicked out of Rome 2 years before his public letter in 2018, as a warning to him to keep his mouth shut. And then Pell was first destroyed in the public eye. If you remember the big mess with Pell in Australia, which that didn't work, but do you remember the financial transaction that nobody knows where it came from? They've been investigating for years. We'll use investigating in quotes here. Financial transaction that no one can account for from the Vatican Bank to Australia that Cardinal Becciu, the fall guy for the recent financial issues in the Vatican, tried to sweep away and say, oh, no, it was for routine things, without ever telling us what that means. But Pell went to Australia, and then suddenly money went with him, but not connected to him, and then his life was destroyed. If you remember that. And when that didn't work, when eventually the system in Australia actually did what its job is supposed to be, he was restored, essentially, and went back to Rome, continued to do his work for some time, and then guess what happened? Had the same fate as Cardinal Sambi. Weird how that works out, isn't it? So, Vigano is in hiding, and they tried to destroy him by declaring him to be in schism and having earned automatic excommunication. You know that Rome mostly works very slowly, right? I mean, we have a synod of synodality that is taking 3 years to do things that, in theory, Francis could just do with a stroke of a pen, but it takes 3 years at this point to do. It's almost like a council. Historically, the Vatican has worked very slowly on everything, including on issues pertaining to justice and canonical law enforcement and everything. They work very slowly, except in the case of Archbishop Viganò, where one day they decided that he was too much of a thorn in their side, and they, in a couple of months' time, charged him with heresy and schism and then excommunicated him. Lightning speed compared to things that are normally done in Rome. And in his interview, he's asked about his excommunication and charge of schism, and he rejects the validity of the schism claim, because of course he does. That's not news. We've talked about that many times here. His answer is detailed on this, so here it is. He says he's not in schism, but that he is trying to protect the integrity of the faith. Quote, "Schism is a sin against the unity of the church. It occurs when a baptized person refuses to submit to the authority of the Roman pontiff and to remain in the communion of faith and charity of the Catholic Church." That's a textbook answer. But what happens if instead of the Pope who defends and governs the church, there is someone who systematically demolishes it? The accusation of having rejected Vatican II has nothing to do with schism, because if anything, it touches on questions of the magisterium and not of canonical discipline. The accusation is specious. There are cardinals and bishops who deny solemnly defined truths of faith, without Bergoglio lifting a finger, indeed with his applause. The anomaly is represented precisely by this council because it was used for a subversive purpose under the formal appearance of a solemn act of the church and with the authoritativeness as well as the authority of the Pope and Council Fathers. The purpose of Vatican II was to create the doctrinal premises, not necessarily explicit and indeed often hidden in ambiguous formulations, to revolutionize the church, Protestantizing it and secularizing it, so as to be able to ferry it towards the syncretistic union of all religions. And this is the project of the Stonecutters, the religion of ecumenical and inclusive humanity. The Second Vatican Council has spread in the church like an affliction. Pope Francis, has committed the entire ecclesial body at every level and rank in its institutions and structures to the subversion of its divine constitution. The new catechism, the new code of canon law, the new mass, the new sacraments, teaching in seminaries and universities, preaching in parishes, the action of Catholic associations, religious life in convents and monasteries. Everything has been tampered with and remodeled according to the conciliar paradigm. The results are there for all to see. End quote. He goes on to talk about Archbishop Lefebvre, who the interviewer attacks as having set up a parallel church, which is simply not true. The SSPX don't have a parallel church, don't claim to be the one true church, and instead have been locked in a sort of rather depressing debate to watch with the Vatican for over 50 years now on the topics of doctrine, heresy, liturgy, and the rest. But they're not in schism. They've never been formally declared to be in schism. Acts of certain members of the SSPX have been declared to be schismatic, but schismatic does not mean you're in schism. Okay, there is a difference. They say the name of the accepted Pope in the canon of the Mass, much to the chagrin of many people these days, and they actually listen to the Pope's directives when they don't conflict with the deposit of the faith. Sadly, for decades, the directives often do conflict with the faith, which tells you all you need to know about the state of things. That Francis isn't the problem, he's just the logical outcome of the problem. And the SSPX these days take a lot of flack for dialoguing with Rome, for accepting Francis as Pope and not taking up one of the many competing theories about him being invalid. I'm not that surprised that they haven't taken that position, taken a side on this, because their position is to hold steady. That is essentially their position, is to hold steady, preserve the faith, try to talk some sense into Rome, which is not that surprising. It's just that there has been changes by degrees over the years on how friendly they are with Rome. Now, that interview, at least for me, helps put the pieces together to explain how we got where we are. And I find interesting, minutes before going live on this, after I'd prepared this for you using the Italian version of this, Archbishop Viganò posted in several languages, including English, the full interview on his own website. So I'll link that in my show notes at returntotradition.org, because I did not go over everything here. He goes over a whole lot more in this. But this does help put the pieces together. The corruption in the hierarchy is very embedded, with figures in the church appearing to be willing to, or really frankly, end anyone who tries to get in their way, or expose their operations, or negatively impact the bottom line. And this has been a problem for decades. The St. Gallen group, I have to call them that, because that word you usually hear associated with St. Gallen, it's a flag term on this platform, but there's a reason people use that actual proper terminology. It's because of things like this. Again, to bring Malachi Martin into this, for are very good reasons, I tell you not to just read Windswept House, but to read the Jesuits and to read Vatican, because when you read those books, you begin to see the history of the 1940s to the 1990s of this crisis in the church, and you see all of the things that preceded where we are today, including those elements within the church who are willing to remove people from this mortal coil if they feel it necessary to protect their interests in the Vatican. It's all laid out there. And Vatican is another work like Windswept House, where 99% of it are real events with real characters whose the real figures just had their names changed. But that's it. Called faction for a reason, because it's mostly fact with a little bit of fiction to weave it together into an actual story narrative, and for we'll call it plausible deniability reasons on the part of its author. And Vigano clearly doesn't want to end up like Cardinals Sambi or Pell. I'm curious what your reaction is to this outline, to everything we just outlined here. So I'm going to check the comments here. Take a look here. Pundex says it is plain the apostolic see is presently regrettably vacant. That is his take. And, you know, a lot of people believe that right now. I don't think that's a sedevacantist position, because sedevacantist don't think there's been a pope for 60 years at this point, 65 years or something. But it's, you know, you see a lot of people saying that now. Philip says it's time for Vigano to put up or shut up, show proof. Here's the thing. He's not actually, this interview didn't bring anything having to do with the other topic, which is the allegation that Pope Francis and Ted McCarrick had, I will say, similar pastimes and similar evils. Why hide? Well, I think he just outlined why. That he thinks he has a lot of work to do for the church, and clearly his two predecessors in the investigations went one place. So I understand why he's in hiding. Vigano belongs to the ultra-conservative church hierarchy? Maybe. I don't know. This conservative and liberal language for internal church affairs doesn't really work, because it tends to be like an American way of understanding things. It doesn't parallel perfectly U.S. politics. Damien says the spiritual darkness has taken hold. It's costing souls to fall into hell like snowflakes. Borrowing a line from Fatima. Yes. Francis is Catholic. On paper. Yes. So Trish's Catholic reminds us of the real remedy. We must do penance, sacrifice, and pray the rosary. Keep the 5 first Saturdays devotion. I constantly tell people to keep the 5 first Saturdays devotion. Please, please consider it. We are, a couple of weeks away from the next first Saturday. You have plenty of time at this point, to prepare yourselves for the first Saturday's devotion. So please consider keeping the first Saturday's devotion. Mark Brown says Cardinal Pell's a red martyr. The state of his body was a message to all the cardinals. This will happen to them if they don't go along with the superforce. The superforce is the term that Malachi Martin used to describe essentially the St. Gallen group and other groups in the Roman Curia and throughout the church, who essentially keep things running for now the Bergoglian types. That they were the ones directing the church. And yeah, so it's a better term, I think, than the one Vigano uses one that is a lot of American political connotations to it. But superforce is an interesting one, because they almost seem undefeatable, almost, but they will lose. And I want to remind people here that at the end of the day, that the church we have been promised the triumph of the Immaculate Heart when we get a pope who stops listening to these people, does the consecration as instructed, names that one country and nothing else, reveals the third secret in a homily, and the consecration is done in a mass, and commands every bishop in the world to do so with him on pain of excommunication. That's it. That's all it will take. But the simplest things are sometimes the hardest to do. Willis, you're there. I can see you. Dr. Obvious reminds us to read the permanent instruction of the Alta Vendita. He's the Pope they described. Right. So if you're not familiar with the permanent instruction of the Alta Vendita, it's a document found from stone cutter groups and copies handed to Pope Leo XIII, who then uses money from his own family fortune to have the thing translated into several languages and published. It was a project he started. Pope St. Pius X continued it, funding it out of his own family fortune, and had copies distributed around the world. And the document details the stonecutter program for the church, which is to get a pope who is not on paper a member of the organization. They actually say that would destroy them if that happened, but instead who is virtually a member, who agrees with them on everything, becomes their champion, and leads the church, billions of Catholics, into being essentially members of that organization, not formally, but by their following his plan, their plans, by adopting their values. That's what the document has. It's one of the first things they recorded for this channel. You can just search through their archives, you can find it. All right, folks. Just keep in mind that when this happens, there will be a restoration of in the church. It is coming, so don't never despair when we talk about this stuff. Yeah, Mark, I can't use that M word. That's found that one out the hard way. But that is how they control things. I thought it was John Venari, but someone from their family contacted me and told me no, it wasn't John Venari, but so it might have been Father Nicholas Gruner. So I remember seeing this discussed on a Catholic Family News video from like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that they brought to Pope Benedict XVI's attention the state of things in the church in America, all the things that were going on that were making the news, and asked, why don't you do something about this? And he says, they say people have written letters. He says, my mail never makes it to my office. Nothing important, nothing like that. He says he actually pointed in that meeting, allegedly, to his office door and said, that is where my authority ends. Give you an idea how this thing, how bad things are. And this is why I go back to Vatican II, because John the 23rd, Cardinal Viganò, had documents ready that were Catholic. I have a few of them recorded here as the original schemas for Vatican II. And they were rejected at the very opening of the council, with the exception of one or two, which were then drastically changed. And the instruments for that were the Periti. These were the advisors to the bishops, men who were in many cases on the Holy Office's watch list as a potential heretic. Many of them were. That's how it happened. These are the same kinds of men who were like the predecessors of the people keeping the Vatican under absolute control for the Bergoglians. But even in spite of that, we still have decent men there who let journalists like Marco Tossati know about what's going on. Because if they had total control on everything there, they wouldn't be preparing so hard to make sure that Francis got a successor like him. They wouldn't be working so hard to make sure that the makeup of the College of Cardinals wasn't completely Bergoglian. They wouldn't be working so hard to try to crush leaks in the Vatican when they come out. There's signs of hope. Traditionalist Catholic says there was a beautiful schema on the hammer and sickle ideology. Yeah, that was... Councils are usually called to address theological questions, heresies. The logical thing to do would have been to address this. Many have pointed out that they wanted to, but for political reasons, they refused to. All right. Thanks very much for tuning in today, folks. And as always, pray for the church and for anybody we spoke about here today. They will need your prayers. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.